very thoughtful in every conversation I've had, and so generous. And so I'm really excited that he's here, and then we get to learn more from him. And so just a reminder, if you're new to Talk Math with your friends, you're welcome to engage the chat. I'll monitor the chat and amplify the things that need to get said out loud if you don't want to or aren't able. Belin has asked for, I believe, his sisters to be featured friends. And so if there's another person or two who wants to sort of be the roundtable for this, you're welcome to unmute and participate out loud, but the rest of us will just sort of engage either the chat or periodically when Belin asks us for engagement. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Belin Tsinnajinnie to Talk Math with your friends.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you everyone for being here. And Yat siya Belin Tsinnajinnie and siya Filipino national Tsinnajinnie was she Filipino that's siya Tsinnajinnie national Santa Fe, New Mexico de Cache. Hello everyone, I'm Belin Tsinnajinnie. I'm a professor in mathematics from Santa Fe Community College, and I use the pronouns he, him, his. And I introduced myself in Navajo, and I introduced myself by giving my mother's clan and my father's clan, and then the clans that were given by my mother's father and then my father's mother, and then saying that I'm in Santa Fe and I'm also from Tsinnajinnie, New Mexico. So when we identify ourselves in Navajo, we identify ourselves in that way, and when we give our clans, a lot of it is giving where we're rooted from and where we're placed in. And I want to, first of all, acknowledge that right now here in Santa Fe, I'm on the traditional lands of the Tewa and Keres Pueblo nations, and more specifically the Nambe and Winge, and those are known as more contemporarily as Poaki, San Ildefonso, Kewinge, Santa Clara, Tusiki, Cochiti, Kiwa, San Felipe, Santa Ana, and Dia Pueblos, and those are their traditional names here. Also in Santa Fe, we're surrounded by other indigenous nations, including the Hickory, Apache, and Navajo nations. And want to expand on that later on, but know that when we're doing these land acknowledgements, want to do more so besides giving, you know, a token response and saying it just because we want to. And I hope to expand on what understanding and describing where we are, who we are, and what lands we're on, and whose peoples we've stolen those lands from, and how we benefit from being on those lands, and also on the lands in being in institutions built by people who were enslaved and stolen from their traditional homelands. Okay, and I think when I proposed this talk, I was interested in giving another talk that I gave at JMM, and Dr. Carrie Diaz-Eaton invited me to give a talk at joint math meetings, and I gave a talk that came in a time where I was responding to a lot of conversations in the math community regarding diversity statements in hiring. And when I prepared that statement, then I was interested in adding on and contributing to those conversations around the roles of diversity and inclusion in mathematics departments specifically, and more broadly in higher education. And I approached that talk by kind of responding to the hot topic at the time. And I'm really excited to give a version of that talk today, but you know, that was like 10 years ago, right? Back in January. So, you know, there are some things that have come about in our professional development math Twitter since then. And a lot of my thoughts are still related to that, but then there are some other things that have happened that I'm interested in integrating with that. So this is a version of that JMM talk but I'm also going to try to weave together some of those topics and conversations that have been happening in math Twitter related to diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice in mathematics. And I say this with many of my talks, that this talk just kind of represents my thinking at the time. My mind is still grappling with these things, and I'm inviting you to grapple with me as well too. I'm not coming with answers, but just kind of thoughts that are ongoing. So in this talk, I label it Disrupting Settler Colonial Mindsets, and kind of the questions that I'm thinking about has to do with, first of all, understanding what roles settler colonialism has had in our understandings, our framings, and experiences in mathematics. When we talk about disrupting settler colonial mindsets in mathematics, what does that look like? And what has happened? And what can it look like? And when we're engaging in disrupting those mindsets, what are such challenges, and what are our responsibilities in either playing a role in that disruption, or sitting back and playing a role in the sense that we're perpetuating those ongoing activities. So I'm going to draw a lot on some of my heroes in mathematics, and draw on Rochelle Gutierrez's work on rehumanizing mathematics, and want to come back to some of her initial framings, or when she introduced rehumanizing mathematics, where she talks about the re as a prefix as opposed to just calling it humanizing mathematics, because she's wanting to acknowledge the fact that humans have been practicing mathematics for centuries in ways that are humane. So humanizing mathematics implies that it was not humanized at one point, but what she's acknowledging is that peoples and other living beings engage in mathematics that were humane ways, and then things happened in a ways that many of us experience mathematics that is dehumanizing, and we're trying to return to those origins where mathematics was a very humane and humanizing activity. So that's kind of like the purpose of the re part. So I want to emphasize that. Also want to draw on the efforts of many of our mathematicians and scholars and women of color in math Twitter, who are also talking about the roles of colonialism and imperialism in mathematics, emphasizing that mathematics is cultural, and talking about Brittany Marshall, and talk more about the all that stemmed from there too, but just acknowledge that those conversations have been taking place and those disruptions are taking place, and just want to draw on those conversations that took place in math Twitter about 2 + 2 = 4, and who has been participating in that and who's been attacked through those conversations. So when I talked about being on native land, I'm situating ourselves in what we now call the Southwestern United States, and what we now call New Mexico and Arizona. And when I talk about that rehumanizing, and I want to come back to that and try to describe what Rochelle Gutierrez means, and from my perspective, about at one point how mathematics was a humane activity. And I introduced myself, and in my background, my Zoom background, this is our home in Tsinnajinnie, New Mexico. And this map here is near the Four Corners region, where the states of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah border. And near that community called Pueblo Pintado, kind of at the bottom where that V road is, that's our home community. And near that home community is Chaco Canyon National Historical Park. And what is there? What is at Chaco Canyon? So at Chaco Canyon, and I mentioned in my land acknowledgements, mentioned that in Santa Fe, we're on the lands of Pueblo peoples and various Pueblo nations here in Santa Fe. And the ancestors of those Pueblo peoples lived here in Chaco Canyon, and their ancestors lived in these places very close to where I grew up and where the Nat people grew up. And what I'm wanting to emphasize here is that their architecture and their ways of being and their ways of engaging with the sky and the universe and their astronomy was embedded in their architecture, and that was embedded in their way of life, and was embedded in all of what they do. So one of their more famous structures is known as the sun dagger. So those three slabs of rock there were positioned in such a way, along with a solar marking on a spiral. So I didn't include a very good picture there, but if you Google sun dagger in Chaco Canyon, you'll see that those three slabs of rock are able to redirect light onto a spiral carved onto that rock behind them, so that the rays of the sun will mark on the spiral equinoxes and summer solstices, along with other different parts of the year. And not only does it do that, but it marks the lunar cycles too, all in one, all in this one embedded structure here. And it's not only the slabs there, but the see that line on the buildings on that semicircle there. Those lines also align with various lunar cycles and solar cycles. And this community, people believe that it was a hub for a lot of Native nations, indigenous nations and indigenous communities before colonizers came. And it was a hub for trade, and it was a hub for ways of living. And there was a great need for them to watch the skies and keep track of the calendars for a variety of reasons. And I'm thinking back about how, in this sense, in the way math is conceptualized, mathematics is being lived. And Rochelle Gutierrez has talked about living mathematician. Mathematics is lived here. It's not abstracted. It's not something that can be expanded on. It's there, and it's rooted in place, and it's rooted in their understanding of in their place in the universe. And for me, in that sense, that's kind of like rooting back to what Rochelle Gutierrez was talking about, that this is the humane way and the embedded in way of doing mathematics in that place. And so bringing that back to our conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what happened between then and now? And I think about, why is it so challenging when people from my communities and people from Native communities and other communities come up and ask me, as a Native person, Native and Filipino person, who are trying to ask me about ways that we can integrate cultural understandings of mathematics and think about traditional Navajo teachings in mathematics. And I have to say, I'm not the person who can do that. I'm not the person who has the knowledge to be able to make those connections. I'm successful in the mainstream notions of mathematics, going through academia and earning my doctorate through there, and in many ways jumping through the hoops to earn those certificates. And that doesn't necessarily certify me to be an expert from indigenous knowledges and be able to speak to that in ways that my ancestors can and are more than capable of doing that. So that has me thinking about Marianne Deagle's question. She's an educator in mathematics, and some of her open questions about, why does diversity and inclusion matter? Why is it the right thing to do? Why do you want me here? And what do you miss by my absence? And bringing that to light, about it kind of questions about why diversity and inclusion matters. And that comes back from those conversations about the diversity statements. And a lot of it comes from popular notions about we need diverse ways of thinking to advance the fields in mathematics. But I think the ongoing question is, what does it mean for us who are often sought out to diversify departments and to diversify communities? What does it mean for us who are being targeted for having that sense of inclusion in these spaces? So I'm going to draw on, like thinking about what happened between what our ancestors did and the way that they engaged in and engaged in humane ways of doing mathematics. What happened between then and now? And I'm highlighting some work from some 6th grade Indigenous and Latina students that I work with, and when they talked about how they did long division in their class. So contextualizing what happened here, I gave them a long division problem. They used the alternative long division problem that I didn't see them using in their classroom. In the classroom, they use a standard division algorithm. But when I interviewed them outside and I said, hey, why don't you do this? They chose to use the algorithm that they learned in 5th grade. When they're in the feeder school, they chose the algorithm that they use. And so I asked them why did they choose this, and why did they call the other division algorithm, why did they call that regular division? So, you know, what Omario and Rory were saying was that I don't like regular division, this is the way I like better. And Omario is saying that everyone in the class is taught a certain way, but they had the way that they like, but they still felt pressure to do division the regular way. Even though their teacher said you could use whatever way you like, everyone was using the regular division. So they still felt those kinds of pressures to do alternative algorithms and use the algorithm that made sense to them. And so I also interviewed a teacher there, and I asked him why he thought there are disparities between Native and Latina communities, and why there are discrepancies there. And what the teacher was saying was that they, and he was talking about the community, don't buy into education completely, and they have to be able to sell the product of education, and that a good teacher sells it and they accept it. So there were some alarming responses from what they did, because I went into the study wanting to understand the role of assimilationist practices of the past and how they impacted the experiences in the present. But kind of in the study, I was coming to realize that these assimilationist perspectives, and this is a quote from the assistant principal, that when the teacher was talking about and the approach of the school was that what students bring into the school doesn't matter. And in fact, they forget what they bring in altogether, and that they feed them their brains with knowledge that they feel and deems important, and talks about that subtractive notion of education, that we have to leave our identities and leave who we are at the door. And so there's this ongoing notion that education is serves the purpose of assimilation, and that the purpose of education was to prepare students to be good workers. So I'm going to pause there, and right now I'm thinking about like how, when I'm asking a question, what changes from the mathematics of our ancestors versus this kind of mathematical experiences that many of us went through and we're having our students go through now.
Sorry, Belin, was that a question you want responses to?
I'm pausing to take my breath, and pausing for people to think in dramatic effect. Yeah. So what's happened? So I'm going to highlight a plaque that honors Richard Henry Pratt. I'm sorry. He is a founder of Carlisle Indian School, and you can say this plaque is honoring his efforts to have an innovative vision, tenacity, and sense of purpose that reformed how Native Americans were educated in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the quote that's on the plaque there, the way to civilize an Indian is to get him into civilization. The way to keep him civilized is to let him stay. So does that sound familiar when we're thinking about diversity and equity initiatives that we might have heard? Right, like sometimes those diversity and inclusion initiatives talk about, hey, let's bring people from diverse backgrounds to the table, and we'll let them stay there. We'll let them stay. Let's let them be part of our community. And at the time, he was praised for being innovative and very humane in his way of thinking, and challenged other notions of educating indigenous peoples, where they only sought to kill them and take their land. So part of what that entailed, oops, and these are quotes from Richard Pratt about the emancipation of Indians. So seeing education as a path towards emancipation and a way for them to secure citizenship, and to gain skills in education so that they can be equal to the rest of us, or at least aspire to gain education so that they can be like the rest of us. And by rest of us, I mean white settlers. And what that meant is taking Native children from their homelands, cutting their hair, prohibiting them to speak their languages, prohibiting them to see family, and prohibiting them from speaking any of their cultures or engaging in their cultural practices. And the big driver for doing that, let's see, and kind of like the famous saying for that was that Richard Pratt aimed to kill the Indian and save the man. And again, this was viewed as a very empathetic and progressive way of thinking about Indian education in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And I always forget to come back to this, but I'm going to make a point that this picture is used as a kind of like the big image representing this practice of assimilation and kill the Indian and save the man. And the stories behind it is that this is a Navajo person. He was known as Hastin Biligana in Navajo. And the story behind this is that he's used as a poster child for assimilation, but in actuality, he went back home and he had his haircut still, and he went back to practicing and living the ways that he had grown up in and the ways that he knew the people. So although he's used as the kill the Indian and save the man image, that failed in his individual story. So I always want to come back to that. I want to make sure that I came back to that there, that the stories in among the Navajo people is that for him particularly, he went on and they failed to accomplish that task. So again, when I talked about the assimilationist practices, I had been under the idea that that happened in the past and that it was over. But then in my study, I was thinking about Melanie, who's a parent of Omario, one of the Native children, and she talked about how the relationship between the Native community and the schools just represented years and cycles of the same thing, of being ignored, of their perspectives and their values and their goals not mattering. And so that just kind of made me realize that assimilation isn't something that happened in the past and that we're feeling the impacts of now. It's been an ongoing project. And so Danny Martin's work kind of helped connect that to me when he was talking about the roles of math, the various math education reforms over the centuries, and how many of those reforms were pitched as a way of promoting equality or equity for Black children and Black communities, but were actually doing other things just under the disguise of math reform and improving math efforts. So for example, the new math movement was a movement in response towards Russians launching Sputnik into space. And there's a great push to get more students prepared to do engineering and STEM, go into STEM fields so that they could compete with Russia to get astronauts into space. So that became the math movement there, and the math reform was pushed through by nationalism and efforts towards nationalistic efforts. The Mathematics for All in the 80s and 90s purported to have a goal for opening up math pathways and providing equal opportunities for marginalized groups. And what many of us realize now is that just giving everyone equal opportunities just expects them to do the same thing in the same ways. And in other words, mathematics education is assimilation. And then the No Child Left Behind Act post 9/11 led to high stakes and evidence-based assessments. And that reduced assessment and in turn kind of reduced understandings of what counted as mathematical knowledge to high stakes quantitative based assessments, and kind of perpetuated those dehumanizing experiences that were probably already occurring. So, connecting all of these reform movements and thinking about how all of these reform movements are made with the purpose of improving equity or improving equality. And what Danny Martin is concluding is that they don't really do any of that. They just end up perpetuating the same thing. And it perpetuates the same kind of assimilationist practices that Richard Henry Pratt did with the Native Americans, just under disguise of new and improved reform practices in math education, because they all still expect that we abandon our identities, that we abandon our ways of thinking, and abandon our culturally based communication styles. And, connecting back to our summer conversations, if you've been on Twitter, I'm wanting to ask all of you, in what ways are such assimilationist practices being practiced today and emphasized? And I'm bringing up like some of the conversations on math Twitter, including carceral pedagogy that was pushed by Dr. Ilana Horn and Dr. Lori Rubel. And, these things have been ongoing for centuries. And early in the 20th century, there was a big study on the impacts of Richard Pratt's policies, and it was deemed an utter failure. And in the 1920s, they said, we got to stop this right now, and we got to let them, we have to emphasize that their cultural values are important, and we have to emphasize that their cultural knowledge is important for their own survival and their own success. So that study was done in the 1920s. So why do we still engage in these kinds of practices today? And this is another pause for us to discuss and think. I couldn't see the chat, so I'm redoing this. Remediation framings. I just had this conversation with others that it's the children who need to be fixed and the communities who need to be fixed. And I'll pause also to open up the chat, distinguishing between clean and messy work capitalism. How do these all play a role in why we engage in practices that have actually been proven to be unhealthy for communities and children? Prepare them for good jobs. Yeah, sometimes it's easier to engage in practices that we succeeded in and will perpetuate the others, go on to the others. Okay, so someone said that the system is racist. All right. All right, so yeah, I don't expect us to like get all the answers here, but kind of build off of that too, that it's a cycle, it's an ongoing cycle and just ongoing practices of assimilation. And on the surface, it might seem it's there because it's racist, and that's a big part of it, that communities of color are seen as less than or and as targets um, of being viewed as inferior. But Stanley Graham notes that these practices weren't perpetuated for the sake of being mean or for the sake of being racist or the sake of oppression for the sake of oppression. It was an ongoing project to colonize Indian minds and Indian communities for the sake of gaining access to Indian labor and the resources that they lived on. So it's a promotion of individualism and emphasizing that you need to think like us, and in that way they gained some labor force and also open up lands in order to gain those resources. So it wasn't just a practice for the sake of being racist to communities that they deemed inferior, but it had a role in their manifest destiny beliefs and their capitalistic approaches and the need to gain access to those resources. And how has that impacted STEM and the Settler Colonial Project? And thinking back to what the roles of diversity and inclusion are, what it means to think of different ways of knowing, and also thinking about what it means to, when we value in mathematics, abstraction and disconnection from place and disconnection from culture and disconnection from our identities. And, you know, there have been plenty of white scientists who have started to question, you know, those roles here. And Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, talked about how sometimes when we pursue science in STEM for the sake of science, that we're disconnected with the ethics there. So I know Victor Piercy is another friend who talks about ethics in mathematics. And often when we talk about advancements in STEM, that's disconnected with the values and needs of our community. And I brought up that we're on the lands of Pueblo nations, and one of those Pueblo nations includes the Pueblo of San Ildefonso, one of the Tewa communities. So Santa Fe is located near the Los Alamos National Labs. And part of the history of the Los Alamos National Labs was that that's where the first atomic bombs were developed and created, and that's part of the secret efforts to create this to create an atomic bomb during World War II. And part of the stories is that the agreements was that the land that they took on were lands of the San Ildefonso peoples. And the San Ildefonso peoples believed that they would be there temporarily until they finished their project. And then after they created the bomb, that they would leave. And that didn't happen. And now Los Alamos National Labs, they've stayed there since then. And they've grown and continued on as a national laboratory and we're literally stolen lands of the San Ildefonso and other Pueblo communities there. And they've had some really bad environmental impacts on the Pueblo communities and other communities, Pueblo communities in the area. And I talk about the NSA too, where there's so much money funneling into pushing mathematicians and other STEM people into the NSA. And that's again, reiterating Danny Martin's point where what drives math education and math program efforts often is driven by political agendas and nationalistic agendas, and seeking to get people in math sciences programs to serve those national security efforts that are imposed on because of social political influence and social political agendas. And they're talking about like what's been disrupted, and there have been mathematicians who are disrupting those projects here. And more recently, and it didn't make it into today's slides, but following the news and math Twitter how there was a large list of people who were in response to the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other Black community members to stop, urging mathematicians to stop engaging in police surveillance efforts and efforts to that promote police surveillance, the state of police surveillance. And so there are disruptions happening here, and there are disruptions that are ongoing, and people who are recognizing it. This isn't new here. And still happening on Indigenous lands where there has to be a resistance to projects such as the 30-meter telescope on the islands of Hawaii and Native Hawaiians, providing resistance to that, and kind of pushing against the idea that advancement of science comes at the cost of indigenous rights to be on the lands that that are part of their identities and their cultures. And there's still those ongoing efforts there. And that often when resistance, when people engage with this resistance, is often met with the notion that resistance is influenced by an anti-science or an anti-STEM mindset, that those perspectives are not valuing science for the sake of the advancement of science. And in other words, that those ideas and those knowledge systems are primitive to quote unquote real science or real STEM. And those are some ongoing challenges that we have to undertake. So some themes throughout here that we're still engaging in assimilationist practices today, that those assimilationist efforts that took place through the Richard Pratt area that sought the labor, land, and resources of marginalized communities is still ongoing today. That when we do land acknowledgements, that when we do so, they can't be tokenized. And if we, that when we acknowledge the stolen land, that still has an impact on our communities right now in 2020, right? That those have an impact. And those conversations still reflect those mindsets that happened early on in the days of the assimilationist practices of Native communities. And what I'm bringing up here is how diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are still pitched today. And this is coming from the JMM page when this first happened in 2020, and how we're framing the need for diverse perspectives as a way to promote innovative mathematical research, advance math achievement, and promote progress in the field, and engaging in the community. And what is the role of diversity and inclusion in that? So the role and the value of diversity and inclusion is to promote and improve math research and understanding mathematical sciences. And so we're still seeing in 2020 that math and science is being privileged as a way to promote math and science for the sake of math and science. But that's the math and science that's being valued today is still the math and science that is engaging in depth of land, depth of resources. And when we're targeting faculty from communities of color and marginalized communities, we're still engaging in practices that take those people from their communities in order to engage in those institutions that we practice our academic practices in. So again, coming back to Marian Dingle's question, why diversity and inclusion? Why is it the right thing to do? Why do you want me here? What do you miss by my absence? And I'm reading Marian Dingle's words, and we should read them as Marian Dingle's words, but think about these words in the sense why we're seeking people to be part of communities as part of our diversity and inclusion efforts. So Maura talks about, why do you think land acknowledgements are appropriate, genuine, say by university? And I need to find this link here, but there's a position statement by, and her, I have to find her name, but the Indigenous scholar, basically a shorthand, in short, for land acknowledgements at university and university settings, there are two choices when we do land acknowledgements. Either give the land back to Indigenous communities or provide free tuition for Native students. And that's the position for universities and colleges. Either it can't be a token statement, it has to actually realize the injustices of being built on stolen lands. And in doing so, either you return those lands to the people or provide some way of service free of charge to those Native communities. Okay. So coming back to like a summary of the diversity and inclusion efforts and how that still perpetuates a lot of those assimilationist practices that Danny Martin was talking about, how we're seeking individuals from underrepresented communities to be included in spaces that already exist, that are already problematic. And there are really no ways to have communities and the values of communities and their cultures and their political needs and their political beliefs to actually make changes to those fields in our STEM fields. So advancements and innovations are being pitched as a need for, all of math and science, but how does that benefit the communities? And for people from marginalized communities who are asked to be a part of these higher ed institutions, there's often, it's often unclear that how it benefits the communities that they come from and the communities that they wish to serve. So when we're conversations when I was thinking about the conversations about diversity statements. And I think there's a need to question the role of diversity and inclusion in general. So there is a lot of pushback and support for valuing diversity statements from aspiring faculty, but what would diversity and inclusion statements look like from departments and universities? And what kind of expectations would we have for departments and universities in describing what their efforts are towards serving marginalized communities? So, what is at stake here? So I talk about how mathematics, and we talk about how Rochelle Gutierrez emphasized the re as a prefix to rehumanizing mathematics, how at one point mathematics was a human thing and embedded in the ways that our ancestors lived. And it wasn't abstracted, it was literally like living those ideas of mathematics. And for many of our communities, our way of knowing that and experiencing mathematics in that sense was disrupted and is being disrupted by settler colonialism. And we have been robbed of that opportunity to experience those ways of viewing and expressing mathematics, which is why I can't say that I'm the person all the time who can make connections between Navajo cultures and mathematics, because I haven't experienced Navajo cultures themselves because of the disruption that our communities experienced through those settler colonial efforts. So those ways of thinking, these places here where this is still evidence where mathematics was rooted and lived and practiced as something that's intertwined with our community's ways of being and knowing. And what's being impacted now is that oil and gas leases, for example, are encroaching on these ancient sites. And not only are they encroaching on ancient sites, they're encroaching on the communities that I live in. So in my background there, where I live. And what's being pitched to our communities are these maps of where they're hoping to plot oil and gas leases and extracting resources. And you might see that it's in an abstract a problem that's been abstracted in mathematics. It's like a division problem, right? We have a area of land and we divide it somewhat equally and then we present it here. But what our community members have to do is they have to contextualize that, because this is what this map represents is the plots of land, and where in our community these plots of lands are being targeted for oil and gas leases. And our community members have to go in here and attach the names of the family members who are in these areas so that we can understand those contexts here. And if we're going to ask what matters to our communities, we come from communities that are for centuries have undergoing efforts to sustain, revitalize, to resist the ongoing settler colonial efforts, to survive and to be in relation with one another and to reconnect with one another and to maintain the relationships that we have with our land, water, and our living beings that we've been trying to sustain for centuries and millennia. So that's kind of like the resistance that our communities are undergoing. And when we think about diversity and inclusion efforts, we're resisting those efforts to gain access to those land, labor, and resources. So the labor of our people, the land and resources, and I'll add the water also, access to our waters. So what we need to do, why this matters, we need a reframing of our diversity and inclusion needs in our programs. So we often want to feel good about ourselves, and I say we because I'm part of the, I'm part of the system as well too, where we're trying to be, we're trying to emphasize diversity and inclusion initiatives so that we can bring in individuals and we take them away from their communities often. And we do that so that we can feel good about our image with respect to diversity and inclusion. But there's a need in order to disrupt that mindset and disrupt that settler colonial efforts. And we need to have a willingness to serve the communities and be reciprocal in our efforts, and be reciprocal to and be accountable to those communities that we serve. And when we express our support and allegiance to serving marginalized communities, it can't be tokenized. It has to have a way of reciprocating and not just bringing people to a seat at a table, but really understanding why that table exists and why we have control of that table in the first place. So coming back to these questions that I posed at the beginning, I'm hoping that we have a better idea of what the impacts of settler colonialism has had on understandings, framings, and experiences in mathematics. What does disrupting it look like, and what are some challenges and responsibilities? So Dr. Stephanie Massa talks about how some ways of disrupting that would be to redefine what counts and who can contribute to mathematics knowledge. So even coming back to Brittany Marshall's and Rochelle Gutierrez's statements at the beginning, where Rochelle Gutierrez talked about rehumanizing as returning back, and she's also talked about how abstraction is a form of colonialism. In her TOTOS talk that she gave earlier this summer, she talked about abstraction as a form of colonialism. And Brittany Marshall talked about how 2 + 2 = 4 represents colonialism, and I need to go back to her words. I think it'd be good for all of us to go back to them. I have a lot of slides. 2 + 2 = 4 is cultural because of Western imperialism and colonization. We think of this as the only way of knowing. And we'll reiterate that is that Brittany Marshall and Rochelle Gutierrez, along with Lori Rubel and many women of color, were attacked, and not only were they attacked through Twitter, but attacked in other spaces too, for having these mindsets. And they're not mindsets, but they're facts, really. And I'm hoping that we can see these statements and have a better understanding of how those statements are true. And again, the emphasis is that she's not questioning that 2 + 2 = 4. And many mathematicians have engaged in that playful idea of philosophically thinking about how there are many ways of 2 + 2 being other things. But when I'm posing the question about what challenges there are for people who are engaging in this disruptions, and part of those challenges include the fact that people who are out there disrupting, doing the disrupting, get targeted, particular women of color. And this might seem like a new idea, but the disruption of settler colonialism in math and science is not new. People have been undertaking that resistance and disruption for centuries since colonizers first landed on this land. And that part of our role is to learn from those who have been doing the work. And in that learning that we better understand how we benefit being in academia, from being in institutions that are built on stolen land from indigenous peoples through the labor of enslaved peoples. And how we privilege abstraction in mathematics. So I'm thinking about how we recall that at some points mathematics was this. And rehumanizing mathematics means, and I've made the case before in talks that we want to consider the roles of place in mathematics, but in doing so, I'm not talking about we as individuals' connections to mathematics, but how the peoples who live on this land were connected to the land and practice mathematics in a way that were connected to their lands and waters and their cultures. And I'm gonna make sure that I give my thanks, to my sisters. So Dr. Leola Tsinnajinnie and Dr. Lonnie Tsinnajinnie, they're my sisters, they're professors at University of New Mexico. Leola's my older sister, Lonnie's my younger sister, and they're both doing awesome things and influence who I am, and always able to draw on their strengths and their awesomeness in what I do. And thank you for the organizers of Talk Math with Your Friends, and also thank you to Dr. Carrie Diaz-Eaton, who invited me to the JMM talk back in January, and gave me an opportunity to talk about this back in January. So I'll pause there and stop for questions.
Thank you, Belin. Do any of your featured friends, your sisters, want to jump in? I want to make sure that we give them some space if they want it.
Leola had to leave for class. Hi, Lonnie, reader.
Hi. Yeah, I think, thank you again for your talk and inviting me to be your featured friend. Always learn something new from you whenever I hear you speak, and then and I feel like it's not something new at the same time. It's more like a reminder. Um, like uh, like whenever our older sister Leola, and she asks like for help, or she asked Belin to help with her daughter's math homework. She asked Belin to help that, and I have to remind her, oh, I think I know how to do math too. And I just think about like, oh yeah, I learned how to do math in school, I but now like when like hearing Belin's talk, I'm like, no, I do. It makes me realize like, no, I do math all the time, and my training is in hydrology, and it's helping me think about like this presentation is also helping me think about who are hydrologists, and it's like everyone studies hydrology every day. We see, we observe like precipitation, we observe evapotranspiration, we observe the water cycle, and we observe all these processes. And like, we know indigenous peoples have all this hydrology knowledge built within their systems, but it's like, yeah, every day we all observe hydrology, so we're all hydrologists too. And so that's like kind of helping me think about, or your talk is helping me think about like, yeah, who else do I consider, hydrologists, or people who know things in my own field. So I think that was just like my takeaway for today, but I always get like these big takeaways every time I hear your presentations.
So Lonnie is why when I talk about land acknowledgements and I talk about relations, I'm reminding myself that we don't have relationships just with the land, but we have relationships with our waters too, and our bodies and our waters in all of their existence and through all phases of the water cycle.
One question from the chat was, so you said you talked a lot about like nationalism and other sort of systemic forces, sort of from the white structures, and also these sort of impacts on Native communities. Do you have anything specific you could add about the teachers? So like the individual teachers, whether they're the ones at the Pratt School or us as faculty?
Yeah, I might have flew through the slide, but the conversations on carceral pedagogy, and when we engage in those practices that continue to dehumanize and attempt to delegitimize our identities and experiences, then that plays that role in that perpetuating those colonial mindsets that aims to assimilate minds and discount community and cultural knowledge. So as teachers, when we can disrupt those mindsets by thinking about those pedagogical practices and thinking about ways that we open up possibilities and open up different ways of knowing and different ways of being. And that doesn't mean like, and I'll be clear, that doesn't mean like learning about another culture and trying to teach that culture, but allowing students to be who they are and represent who they come from, and what the rehumanizing mathematics mindset was, allowing them to be them, and allowing them to not only see themselves in represented in math curriculum, but be able to see the humanity of others in mathematics curriculum as well. So it's not something that's just for students from marginalized communities, but for white students too, that it's important for those students to better understand and see what diversity means in a way that respects and disrupts other colonialism. So what is something specific we can do to change the colonial mindset? So there have been, I'll make a pitch to what Kate Owens and Dr. Kate Owens and Dr. Spencer Bagley have been doing with the mastery grading, and others here, organizers, were talking about mastery grading, and they've touched on it in their talks too. But you know, like questioning the role of grades, questioning the role of points, questioning the roles of standards, in how we tie that into their practices. I've also brought into this through IBL, and Dr. Brian Katz brought me in to speak at the IBL conference, and we're trying to challenge the ways that we might have been successful in mathematics, and we're successful because we did certain things, but how did that provide barriers to others, and how did that discount the identities of people around us? So, you know, there are some things that we can do that can challenge what is comfortable to us, challenge how we became successful at mathematics, and try to disrupt that cycle where we're just teaching the way that we were taught and challenging those ideas and those notions. Yeah, thank you, Nana.
So we need to pause the video of your talk next week. Then we'll thank Belin. And then as far as I'm concerned, we can keep asking questions. Jesse, are you still here?
Yes.
Great.
Hi, I'm Jessie Orline. Next week, I'm talking about atmospheric science and using climate models to understand a certain part of the atmospheric system. It's a complicated system that works on a lot of scales in multiple dimensions. There are many different approaches we can take to trying to understand parts of it, but one of the tools I use is sort of large Earth system models that are based on mathematics. So I'll talk about those in general, and then sort of specific examples where we can see why we might want to use them.
Great, thanks. Great, can everyone join me in thanking Belin for today's session?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us.